My first memories of Huntsville are living on McClung Street, and a lot of the colleagues of my father and their families lived there, so we were the neighborhood gang around McClung Street, and it was a very undeveloped part of Huntsville. There was still a lot of cotton fields all around us, and it was just a big playground. So our neighborhood between McClung and Hermitage, a lot of my father's colleagues lived there, so it was kind of a little German neighborhood surrounded by cotton fields. And the Heimbergs lived right behind us. Ruth Heimberg was one of my earliest friends from childhood. The Graus lived there, the Palaoros lived there, the Zendlers. There were just a lot of German families and their kids. So I only knew the rocket scientists through their children. We knew we were among the German groups because a lot of us grew up speaking German, being bilingual. But our parents really shielded us from a lot of publicity, so I don't feel like we ever grew up any different. Didn't feel like that from my end. It felt maybe like that to other people about us, but we always felt welcome and happy everywhere we were in Huntsville, so it really didn't feel like any kind of a separation or a different group. I think I still think of him as just my dad. I mean, I only knew him as my father, so he was only famous to other people, but not so much to us. He was just our father. But I think there were a couple of times when we lived on McClung, the Life magazine came and did an interview, and I think I was about 5 years old. So again, that didn't really, it was just a bunch of people coming into the house with cameras, but I didn't have a sense of why that was special or unique, except our mother probably said, straighten up, don't screw up this afternoon, that kind of thing you would say to a 5-year-old. But I don't think I really ever thought of him that way, and I probably still don't. I still think of him first and foremost as my father. So at home, I think one of the first things to realize is he was not particularly handy at home. We make jokes about it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to, figure out how to run a microwave. Well, he wasn't particularly useful around the house. My mother would definitely attest to that. She was the person who knew how to fix everything. I think part of it was he probably wasn't interested, so he was probably sort of dodging home chores that way. But mostly when he was home, he was with us. So he was very much, when he came in the door, he was our dad first and foremost, and we were the center of his world. He did bring a lot of work home. That was usually after dinner. But between the time he came home and through dinner, he was very much there for us, and we were primary. He probably worked every night that he came home. He never came home without a briefcase. But the weekends were ours, especially Sundays. That was reserved for family day. We usually went to Guntersville. He loved water, so everything having to do with water. Guntersville was our closest big water, so we water skied and played. And Sundays, I don't remember him ever bringing work on the boat. My 9th birthday would have been May 8th, 1961, and that was 3 days after Alan Shepard was going up in space. And I remember for my 9th birthday, my parents saying they were going to celebrate my birthday early. And I didn't really know why, but of course I was happy. That meant you got presents early, right? And so we had my birthday party a few days early, and I just remember them sort of saying, Dad has to be out of town. And then I realized later, that was Alan Shepard's launch into space. But I don't remember them ever saying that. It was all about my birthday. And I think that was pretty typical. He centered, that the home life was really pretty normal, and it didn't bring a lot of that home. I think all the Mercury 7 astronauts visited us. I particularly remember one trip when I was probably about 11 or 12, so it would have been the early 60s, mid-60s. We were at the Cape, and it was probably for a test of some sort. It wasn't a launch, because the first launch I saw was Apollo 11. And I remember Gordon Cooper was there, and I remember meeting Gus Grissom at that particular little Florida hotel with a swimming pool. They were real simple in those days, and we were all staying at the same hotel, and we're in the pool together. And that was kind of cool, because I was with one of my girlfriends, and we're swimming with the astronauts. Education was absolutely number one, but I don't remember ever feeling pressured into a specific direction. Our dad was interested in a lot of things besides space. He was very musical. He was very interested in history. He read all the time. And my sister and brother both majored in history. I majored in engineering, but it wasn't by any direction. I think he felt like whatever we wanted to do was fine as long as we worked well at it, worked hard at it, and did well in school. That was more important than what we did well at. I think he was pretty happy to learn that I was motivated to the sciences. He was really the first in his family to be scientific. Most of them were lawyers and pastors and had businesses and stuff, but he was sort of the science outlier in his family. Well, one of my great memories, and this is actually, I think, another great lesson, is he took trips with us children individually. So it wasn't always the family trip where the siblings are usually bickering. He took us on our own trips. So one of the trips I made with him was to Mexico to go scuba diving. And that was just me and him. And so you had him all to yourself, and it was treasured. And he did things like that with my sister and brother as well. So those were really, just treasured times. He did travel all over the world. We, of course, did a lot of trips to Germany to visit relatives. He did go to Antarctica. We didn't go with him, but I've seen the pictures. I think that was a great adventure. He loved to go to places that were sort of unworldly or like a different planet. We visited Katmai Volcanic Park because that was another moonscape kind of place. It looks like the lunar surface. So he liked visiting places like that, but he loved to travel. He got the travel bug in all of us, I think. I think he and Kennedy were very like-minded. I think they were both real visionaries, super optimistic people. So I think he liked Kennedy a lot. And I think my parents were thrilled to know him. And of course, his death was a huge tragedy, not only for the country, but I think it was a very personal tragedy for him. And I do remember the day Kennedy died was one of the days that Dad came home, and it was a very somber day for the family. And our mother sort of said, your dad wants to be alone tonight. Let's not bug him. Well, I think he flew every chance he got. So every business trip that he was allowed to fly the plane, he probably did, because that was relaxing to him. As a child, a lot of times on the weekends, he would charter a plane. I have to say, I'm the only member in my family that did not learn to fly. My sister learned to soar. My brother had a pilot's license. My mother had a pilot's license. I was the kid in the back of the plane, usually throwing up, saying, "When does the plane land?" So that was not one of my favorite of his hobbies, but he loved to fly. And I think the two things that were his real recreational loves, number one by far was flying, and number two, anything to do with water, swimming, scuba diving, sailing. Sailing isn't that different from flying. So, well, I think he and Disney were also very like-minded, incredibly creative. I think he needed Disney to explain things, because after all, he was, even though he had great charisma and great personality, was a great speaker and could convince people, Congress, to do things. He was still a scientist, and he needed somebody like Disney's creativity and visuals to help explain things to people. And Disney was also, had an incredible visionary imagination, so I think they had a lot in common that way. I think he thought about spirituality and faith a lot, perhaps more than he did about organized religions. I'm trying to remember Frank Borman's quote. I think he said, "I didn't see God, but I saw his evidence." I think it would be more along those lines of, you can't look into space without thinking big thoughts about creation. He wasn't a regular churchgoer because we usually went water skiing on Sundays. But I think he was definitely a person who thought very profoundly about faith. I think I realize now how much he must have foreseen, not only in terms of, our vulnerable planet and how we better learn a lot more about it to be able to protect it. If you look at climate change, all of the data, all of the information that we're learning is from space, and we better find the solutions here on Earth. But I think he just saw that this vulnerable planet was going to need a lot more understanding than we had. And that's why later in his career, he was very excited about everything we could learn from satellites. And I think the same is true in communication, the same is true in medicine. I mean, if you think of all of the space benefits that we've had, I think he and his team were the kind of people that just saw the opportunities, not specifically, they just knew if we do this to go to the moon, we're going to learn all kinds of stuff that we haven't thought of because we haven't needed to think of them, and they are going to be beneficial. He was very committed to equal employment opportunities for people of all backgrounds and both genders. So I think, growing up he had 2 daughters and a son, I think he also saw that the independence of women was going to become very important, and our ability to have independent employment was certainly important. I got quite involved in the civil rights movement when I was in high school, and I think part of that was more of an organic, that was the way I was raised without really realizing it, because of course in Alabama in those days there was a lot of political navigating to do, which he had to do. But I don't remember him explicitly talking about it too much at home. Our mother is very private. She did have to live a public life a lot, which she protected us from fiercely, which I'm very grateful for, really. I think it was harder to do than I realize. She's very strong, very independent. She just turned 90. And I think because our father traveled so much, he was probably gone almost every weekday during some portion of the work week. But he tried to be home on weekends, so she had to do all the heavy lifting. I mean, she really had to run the household. He wasn't interested in it. He didn't really have time for it, and she just picked up all the slack. So I think that is really an amazing testimony. I think there were a lot of women of her generation who did that without whom the guys that were on the rocket team would have never made it. I think she just was always the glue. So when he came home, she didn't dump problems on him. She knew that was not going to be part of their marriage, and so she had to handle a lot of things by herself. And yeah, my father's parents lived with him in Texas. When my parents were newly married, they came over here with his parents, and they also lived with him in Huntsville for a number of years. So after the war, a lot of the scientists here in Huntsville were sending care packages back to Germany weekly, saving their money, sending things back. But he actually was able to bring his parents over here for a while, so we were close to them as young kids. And my mother's parents also visited quite a bit. So I was close to all 4 of them. I think a lot of that post-war generation really didn't talk about the war much. In fact, my husband's father was an American soldier, and he said his father and their friends never talked about the war either. So I think there was a period of time there when, especially for the German scientists, when they came to America, it was such a dream come true to come here, to surrender to the Americans, to get to live here, then to become American citizens. That was like the whole new life, and they really didn't want to look back much. They were forward-looking people anyway, being space revolutionaries, but they didn't really talk about it much. And I think that's true of a lot of the, my peer group of children of the other scientists. I think that was quite true. I think his management skill, not only in selecting the right people, keeping the right people, keeping them motivated, and really listening to people. A lot of times managers talk, and they're not really listening, and it's usually the people that are doing the actual work that have a lot to tell you about what's working and what doesn't work. And I think he very much created an atmosphere in his management team of, if there are problems, we need to hear them. He didn't surround himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. He would have been disdainful of that because they needed to know if there were problems so that they could solve them. But you got to create an atmosphere for people to come forward with issues so that they feel like their jobs aren't going to be threatened if they tell you about some problem. And it was completely the opposite. It's like he would welcome and value it if something came up that they needed to know that was a problem, no matter how small. And I think that's a huge, important lesson in management. And the people that I've met, of course, maybe this is only what they're going to say to me, but they all seem to very sincerely express how much they enjoyed working with that team. Because well, I think he was the kind of person that when he was talking to you, you were the focus. And that makes people remember where they were when they met him and things like that. But he just had that ability. You were just the only person in the room, and some people just have that magic. But he was also very absent-minded. I think my mother tells a story. They went to the White House one time when Eisenhower was president, and my father left his tie in the hotel room. I mean, literally, he was showing up at the White House without a tie. And, of course, they were running late, so they couldn't go back. So they asked, I think they got into the garage or something, and they asked one of Eisenhower's many aides if they could borrow a tie. And he ended up wearing one of Eisenhower's ties. And my mother said, she felt like all through dinner, Eisenhower was kind of looking at him like, do I have a tie just like that? I went to the Apollo 11 launch. It was the first launch I went to, which, gosh darn, why didn't we get to go to any of the earlier ones? Because we were in school, right? But we all went to the Apollo 11 launch. And in those days, you could sit a lot closer to the launch pad than in subsequent years. So it was, of course, completely overwhelming, breathtaking. It was a gorgeous day in Florida. And then we flew home and watched the landing on TV like everybody else in the basement on black and white television. And I think our father went from the Cape to Houston to watch the landing. So he wasn't with us at that point. But yeah, that was a pretty exciting day. But, I realized that at least as kids, as young people in those days, we never expected that it wouldn't happen. I don't really remember thinking, what if something goes wrong, or what if they don't make it to the moon? I just remember thinking, well, they're going to the moon now. And, now they've landed on the moon. It was just inevitable. And I think that was a lot of the way that the rocket team, and it was definitely a team, it wasn't just him by any means, that was just the way they thought. Of course they were extremely careful, and they had redundancy, and they had quality control, and they had, what-if scenarios and all of that. But I think they just were extremely optimistic and just knew it was going to happen. And they just programmed everything to be successful. And I think that's a management tool we often overlook. We get hung up and, well, we better not try that because it might not work, instead of saying, well, let's figure out how to make it work and how to make it successful. One of his quotes, which I love, is, research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. And since I spent a lot of my career in academia, I used to love that quote because research has all kinds of connotations in academia. But I think getting to the moon and the space benefits of getting to the moon, they were unknowns. They didn't know what it was going to take to get there until they started working on it. And so we didn't really understand all the benefits that we would get from going to the moon until that had happened. And they're probably still understated. I mean, probably everything around us has some piece of technology that was uncovered in material science or in medicine or in communications, and you name it. I think later in his life, he was still only, because he died 7 years after the moon landing, or 8 years after the moon landing, we're still only beginning to understand all the benefits of that technology, and we're still getting them, and that's another reason to always keep exploring and keep learning, not only about this planet, but about other planets and other things in the universe, because we're always going to learn more about ourselves and our own world from doing that. I think my parents, they loved Huntsville. Huntsville was always good to them. Huntsville was where they raised their kids, mostly. I mean, my brother was still pretty young when they moved to Washington, but I think they had they were leaving behind a really good time and a good place in their life. But they had also, they always identified themselves as big city people growing up. So I think Washington was more like living in Berlin had been, and being a capital city. So I think they also liked that about Washington. Well, I think right after the moon landing, all intentions were to now work on the Mars project, get into Mars. And so I think the team was very much, I think even in his notes and in his calendars and in his speeches, right after the moon landing, they were already talking about, okay, now we've done that, now we're going to Mars. So when the bottom fell out from under that, politically and economically in the country, I think that was a point of pretty big disappointment. He went from Huntsville to NASA headquarters and wanted to work on Mars, and that just wasn't happening. So then he left NASA and went to work for Fairchild Industries and started really looking more at Earth observation satellites and satellite telemetry and satellite communications. And that was what he was doing at the end of his life. And I think, one of his early books that's dedicated to my sister and myself said, in your lifetime, spaceflight will be commonplace. I mean, that's what we just assumed it would be commonplace, so it's kind of surprising that it isn't. But I think it was more the mission that changed, in his work that was the disappointing part. I like to think of one of his legacies as to pursue impossible dreams. I can't imagine how many people told him in his life that what he was trying to do was ridiculous and impossible and why bother kind of things, that he had to answer those questions all the time. And I think there are a lot of times that we just don't take enough, we think of risk-taking as a bad thing. You take risks because it's an adventure and because there are things we need to learn, things we need to explore, but not focusing on inherent dangers all the time. So I think he was just an incredible optimist and a visionary and just programmed things to be successful. I think he surrounded himself with an incredible team of people. They worked very closely together. They all believed in a shared vision, and I think that was just part of who he was. It's kind of how he worked with people and helped them all realize this incredible big dream that they had.